This is a historical moment for me.
Shall we? Shall we lead on?
Great.
So this is the Churchill bunker from which my grandfather directed the war. We're going to the basement of the Treasury building, the government Treasury building, and that's where Mr. Churchill's headquarters was during the war, for use during air raids.
The weather's been glorious, hasn't it?
That's where I communicated.
And I will show you the very room from which those calls were made. I'm afraid there will be a few such.
Yeah, we're going to do that about 6 times.
There are other chairs. We have other chairs.
The very first room I want to show you, through this window, is the cabinet room. And that gives me an opportunity to explain a little bit of the history of this site to you. In this room, Mr. Churchill and his cabinet met, particularly during air raids, both in 1940 and 41, and during the period of the mini blitz in 44-45. About 1 in 10 of all the cabinet's meetings during the Second World War were held there. But as you know, Mr. Churchill was also Defence Minister and a very proactive leader of the country.
He didn't trust anyone else to be Defence Minister.
And so he would have scores of informal meetings, meetings with the chiefs of staff, meetings with individual ministers and other committees in this room from the time that he was made Prime Minister to the very end of the war. And if you wish, I will now take you into that room so that you can enjoy the experience of being in the same room.
And that chair there was my grandfather's chair at the back. Not very comfortable. No.
It's wooden and hard, but that's the way things were in those days.
I bring a very comfortable chair on the plane with me.
You're very smart. And the 3 chiefs of staff, Army, Navy, Air Force, were there facing that way, directly facing him, and the other members of the War Cabinet ran the outside.
Shall we go in and have a...
Can we readily
Yes,
get
we're
in?
going to take Mr. Frank in to see the room.
To the right.
Shall I lead?
Please.
I'm right behind you, Mr. Frank.
Yeah. And it's only 4 feet high. It was desperate for the accommodation. There were about 700 people who worked here around the clock.
Wow.
They went down there if the bomb was coming.
Yes.
When the
No,
planes
they went down there to sleep. That was the sleeping accommodation. This was the working level.
This is the entrance to the cabinet room, which you can see is guarded by a marine sentry.
There's a step. There's a little step there, champ. You gotta watch.
It's a low ceiling also.
So just watch that step.
And then a chair for you on your left.
And here's a chair right here on our left.
Watch your step.
Well, Mary doesn't
He
like
wants to
that.
sit in Winston.
Try the other chair. This one is best.
Oh, you got a cigar there.
Okay.
Oh, we need a shot of that. So this is where many of the decisions were made that saved the free world.
Great. Where's my lighter?
Getting it right now.
I thought you were going to say, where's your whiskey and soda? That's what my grandfather would be saying.
Where's the brandy and champagne? Where's the room where he would communicate with Roosevelt?
Well, you'll see that in a minute.
Okay.
That's some torch.
But when this place was opened by Margaret Thatcher, I think it was, or
Yes, in 1984.
1984, so 21 years ago, they managed to get as many of the old staff who had worked here as possible. And I was talking to one of the secretaries, and I said, what is the principal difference between then and today? And she said, oh, the sweetness of the air. Because in those days, first of all, there was no air conditioning, just some very basic ventilation.
Right.
And everybody smoked. And my grandfather smoked cigars, not quite as big as yours, but I mean 80%, 90% of people in this room would have been smokers.
And you can see around the room the ashtrays.
Yeah.
Mr. Churchill's was the biggest.
Right.
Mr. Attlee sat on this side, and he smoked a pipe, so he had a special kind.
Right.
And here sat the Cabinet Secretary to take the minute of the meeting.
And probably nobody's smoked a cigar in here since.
No, I don't think they have.
It's been a long time since they've had the smell of a cigar here.
And if the sprinklers go off, I apologise.
There are sprinklers.
And that's one of my grandfather's dispatch boxes. And implausibly, it's got a Barbados sticker because my father used it when he was writing the great biography of his father. And he took it off to Barbados to work on the book. And that's how he got the Barbados sticker. And I presented it a few years ago.
Now, if you look above you, Mr. Frank, you can see these steel joists. When the building was selected in 1938, at the time of Munich, to be the Cabinet's headquarters, it was done in a great hurry, in a characteristically British fashion. Committees had sat for 20 years talking about what would be done with the government, where it could safely go in the event of a Second World War. And the Cabinet Secretary at the time of Munich hurriedly thought, I must find somewhere safe, and this was a modern building. Actually, it wasn't safe. If a bomb had fallen upon it, it would have come all the way through to here. And Mr. Churchill discovered this in late 1940, and that winter a great protective slab of concrete was inserted above with the help of American contractors, because American contractors had the concrete technology for pumped concrete installations, which we didn't have in this country.
It was safe then?
It was reasonably safe against the smaller kind of bomb.
But
then
a
being dropped.
2,000-pound bomb would have done for this place very easily.
And in any case, Mr. Churchill was very disobedient, wouldn't obey any of the regulations and instructions, and in air raids, instead of hiding down here, he went up on the roof.
No, but the reason he went up on the roof was that his wife, my grandmother, was an auxiliary air raid ward. And so he said, this is just not on. I'm being sent below while my wife is on the roof with her binoculars spotting for fires. And so he was very embarrassed by that. So shall we move on?
Yes.
Very good. This is a thrill.
Wow.
Well, this isn't open to the general public at all.
They can only look in it. The other thing I should have pointed out to you, all these blotting pads are original and the maps all installed here in 1938 and 1939.
Winston Churchill on the left, yeah. I said Winston was opening it up for you.
I'm just seeing if there are any doodles left from those days or rude remarks.
What's that? His original pen?
Yes, everything is absolutely original to that time.
Rick, you haven't gotten any of them.
We have his inkwell. We have his inkwell and his letter opener.
Yeah. I think you got a letter opener, didn't you?
Yeah, we have a letter opener and an inkwell.
Wonderful. Good, shall
There's
we
much
move
more
on?
to show you. So all arranged along this corridor, which was originally a basement storage area. But there's one thing that I must show you. Because the staff were working down here in secret, they didn't know what the weather was like upstairs. So the carpenter made this sign with different labels to put in, depending on the weather. One of them said windy, And that was the sign that was put in when there was an air raid taking place.
Windy.
Windy. Unfortunately, a naughty person stole it at the end of the war, so it doesn't survive. If you look to your right, sir, you will see that above the door is the sign Prime Minister. And this is the entrance to the Prime Minister's office. And the room straight ahead in front of you is where his principal private secretary sat and worked and guarded the entrance.
And what?
His principal private secretary.
What you would call his chief of staff.
That's right.
And did he have brandy and other refreshments?
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, that went without saying.
Especially champagne. And I'll show you a bottle of that. And all the furniture comes from number 10 Downing Street. Yes. This is the main map room, and we will come back to
We'll
that.
come back to that. Now we're taking a swing into the new Churchill Museum. We're leaving the Cabinet War Rooms.
But I must first show you this, which is one of the most important rooms. This is the little room whose door was disguised as a bathroom. And inside, only Mr. Churchill was allowed in. And inside was the apparatus that was used for him to speak on the first hotline to the President in the Oval Office in Washington.
And that's where he would say BGO.
That's right.
KBO, keep buggering on.
Oh, KBO.
KBO, that's it.
KBO.
You've been watching too much HBO. But it was an amazing affair, this transatlantic, because there was a landline to Selfridge's store basement in Oxford Street, which was a very major telecommunications centre. From there it went by landline to the northwest coast of Scotland. From there it was beamed by high-frequency radio, I think to Newfoundland. And from Newfoundland, again, cable down to Washington, D.C. Wow. How they could ever hear each other, I don't know.
I believe that they used to have a little banter as to who was to make the call and who was to be woken up first. And Mr. Churchill was rather naughty, I think, and used to make the calls sometimes when he knew the President was otherwise in bed.
But also, and the whole thing was encrypted. And so that must have made it even less distinct.
Right.
Now, sir, if you would like to come this way, we will take you to the new Churchill Museum, which is now the permanent national museum, telling the story of Mr. Churchill's life and achievements.
And which the Queen was opened by the Queen in February of this year.
Does the Queen just climb all the steps?
Sorry?
Does the Queen climb all the steps?
Oh, yeah.
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 How old is the Queen now?
How old?
79.
Yeah. 79.
79.
We do a great deal of educational work here. We have about 400,000 visitors here a year. 10% of the children in formal school parties, which is very important.
And we're trying to get as many young people through, because you can't imagine how loosely educated they are in the schools about history. There was recently an opinion poll among young teenagers, who was Winston Churchill? And 15% said he was an insurance salesman, because there's an insurance company which advertises on television called Churchill, nothing to do with the family. And I mean, it's absolutely appalling how little they know.
I wanted to show you how much help we had had in making the exhibition from compatriots of yours in the United States. About 60% of all the visitors to the Cabinet War Rooms, since it opened in 1984, are American citizens. 60%, which is a remarkable statistic, and shows how much Mr. Churchill is respected and revered by your fellow citizens in America. So several of
various Palm Beach friends of ours donated generously. I don't know if you know Audrey and Martin Bruce. And the Kravises, Damon Wells from Houston, Texas.
Yes. It was
My ex-mother-in-law, Lee Annenberg.
yes?
Yes.
Paula Annenberg was.
She gave a very generous donation.
Oh, yes.
Your ex-mother-in-law, is that right?
Yes, she was
I-
married to my father-in-law, and she went to a party without him, and Walter Annenberg said to the host, "I'm gonna marry that girl." He said, "You're crazy, that's Lou Rosensteel's wife." He said, "I'm going to marry her." So he was richer than my father-in-law, so naturally, you'd want to go to the rich one. So that's the story of Lee Annenberg.
I visited Lee earlier this year
Did you
in Palm Springs.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, that's a beautiful place.
Lovely place, Sunnylands.
Yeah, sunny.
The last time I was there was with Walter.
Lee Walter.
Yeah. Now, my grandfather said to, sorry, that's the plaque commemorating the opening by the Queen.
Out there, but
So,
Winston, do go on, because that's important.
my grandfather, when he was in his early 20s, said to one of his lady friends, who happened to be the daughter of the Prime Minister, he said, "We are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm."
I'll explain to you how the exhibition works. Because the historic site of the Cabinet War Rooms is all about 1940 to 45. We start the exhibition in 1940 when Mr. Churchill becomes Prime Minister. And the first half follows his career through the Second World War until his death and funeral. And then we restart the exhibition with Mr. Churchill as a baby, and the conclusion is the very door of number 10 Downing Street through which he stepped when he became Prime Minister. And we come to that.
You know, I was a good friend of Lord Bracken, Brendan Bracken.
He was a godfather of mine.
Was he?
Yeah.
Wow.
A crazy Irishman from Australia.
Yeah, could lie like hell, didn't mean a thing.
Oh yeah, he claimed his other godfather was Lord Beaverbrook, Minister of Aircraft Production. He was a crazy Canadian from Fredericton, New Brunswick. Yeah, he arrived in 1915, bought the Express newspapers, and within 2 years he was pulling down governments, putting up governments. In those days, the media barons had even more power than Rupert Murdoch.
Later on, I'll show you Mr. Grafton's room down here in the Cabinet War Rooms.
Oh, I'd like to see that. That's, you know.
Now, as we progress,
This was the Home Guard. You see what weapons they had in 1940. These are broomsticks. They only had damn broomsticks.
here we have excerpts from different speeches by Mr. Churchill that you can hear.
Adolf in Paris.
And I'd like just to pause here.
An excerpt from Churchill's broadcast to the nation.
Do you hear the speech?
Yeah.
That's
Great.
very difficult. Listen. We'll go on.
Battle of Britain pilots. You were at their dinner last week, I think.
R.J. Mitchell.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fantastic what you've done to memorialize it. Thank you for doing that.
Did you see the double page I got?
I did.
Yeah.
My son Randolph sent it to me.
Great.
No, bravo. That's fantastic.
The Blitz with
Amazingly, all the buildings around St. Paul's were flattened, but St. Paul's survived.
here we show the enormous travelogue that Churchill completed.
These are all the journeys he made between Washington and the Far East. He was 65 when he became Prime Minister for the first time.
You know, I was 75 when I thought about Gregor's Country.
That's not bad.
No.
What are you cooking up now?
So, I got another one. You know, when you retire, you die. So
you
I
don't
don't feel
intend to
like
retire?
dying.
No.
Very unwise to retire.
You've got to live, live, live until you die, as the old song says.
We'll make a right here. Now, one of the most significant elements of the Second World War story are what Churchill called his golden eggs.
We need to get a
This
picture
is
of that.
the decrypted information that was secured by secret wireless traffic listening into the German messages. This is the machine that was used by German forces.
That's the
to-
Ultra.
That's
called
the Ultra.
It's the Enigma machine.
Ultra was what, the second generation?
No, Ultra was the name of the traffic,
Right.
the decoded traffic. And we have a little graphic here. Churchill refers to this information as his golden eggs, the goose that laid the golden eggs. Here is a golden egg that refers to Pearl Harbor, and Jerry will read the question. that
Did
is on.
Churchill know about that Japan was planning the attack on Pearl Harbor? And
And
now,
then we have a scrambled message, and which eventually settles in and tells us that in the autumn of 1941, Churchill knew that Japan would attack somewhere in the Pacific, but Japanese codes were now virtually unbreakable, and Churchill had received no specific intelligence about an attack on the Americans.
You
at
know,
Pearl
I
Harbor.
think that Roosevelt knew they would attack Pearl Harbor, but he wanted to get into the war.
I hope you're right. I mean, all I think my grandfather knew was that the German high seas fleet were at sea. We thought that their possible destination was Singapore. But it was equally possible that it was heading for Hawaii. But nobody, I mean, there were no satellites or anything like that, and nobody knew, and they observed very strict radio silence.
So a very important part of the story and of the Allied success in the Second War. We're going to turn that
What was
around.
very important was that my grandfather was able to read
let me slip back.
on a daily basis
Thank you.
the signal traffic between the German High Command in Berlin, effectively between the Führer and the generals in the field, so Rommel in the desert, and saying, you know, there can be no question of retreat, you've got to stand and fight, and you know, all this was desperately important intelligence.
Right, it was. I have movies on that,
Really.
on the whole thing, and how we broke the submarine war that destroyed so many.
Mind you, Hollywood has a different version. I don't know if you saw that movie 3 or 4 years ago, where it wasn't the Royal Navy who got these machines, but it was the U.S. Navy.
This is one of Churchill's famous siren suits, which I think, Winston, this would be evening dress. This is a velvet
no,
one.
this is a post-war upmarket version, which my grandmother had made for him for the evening later in life. During the war, they were much more functional. They were ordinary sort of suit material. But the whole purpose of them, A, like you, he didn't like wearing a tie. And B, if he was disturbed in the middle of the night because there was some major crisis, he could leap into this and zip it up with nothing on underneath and just go into the cabinet.
Good.
There he is at the White House in 41, demonstrating his siren suit.
That's a great picture of him.
Yeah.
And a very happy one. He, of course, also liked wearing uniforms.
In light of him,
That's Roger Moore in North Africa.
Of course, he was in Times Square because it's a lieutenant colonel's uniform, and he, in the First World War, was a lieutenant colonel in the British Army. Now, there are a number of personal items here to show Churchill's working method. Your grandfather liked to work in bed.
And he had an ample belly, so it was cut out to accommodate his belly.
So this is his bed table.
He would sit on his bed in front of him.
And it's the first of two that were made. We have it because halfway through the war, he said to his assistant, "Do you know, I think I need another table with a bigger cutout in it, please." And the old one, this one, was given to the assistant who gave it to us. Mr. Churchill was a prodigiously hard worker, and much of his work was dictated to his secretary. And instead of, because of his very eloquent speech, instead of taking shorthand, she would type directly to paper. And this is an American silent typewriter.
Because previously all the British ones were very, very noisy and it disturbed him. And FDR sent him the silent one.
Winston, could you tell us about this quote here on the glass? Because Sidney himself has a cat as well.
Black
What's
cat
that?
Nelson
There's
sprawled
Black
under
Cat
the
Nelson.
bed every now
Sprawled
and
at
then.
the foot of the bed, and every now and then Winston would gaze at an affectionate and say, "Cat darling."
See, he's down his cat on his bed.
And that's one of his cigars.
And Beaverbrook says the use of his matches outstrips his consumption of cigars, because he would often let it go out and then he would suck it and then he would relight it. He probably only smoked 3 or 4 a day, but he always had one there from early in the morning.
Well, that was his signature.
Yeah.
That's my signature.
When he had to put on a tie, he put on a bow tie.
Your son was
Have we got my paper lined up?
George likes cigars.
Here's one of the new ties.
Which was his favorite.
Your cigar lit again, champ?
Broke is my favorite.
Uh-huh. Well, the reason why Paul Roger was his favorite was the first time he went to liberated Paris in '44, the first dinner at the British Embassy. He was seated next to somebody called Odette Paul Roger, whose husband owned Paul Roger Champagne. And she told my grandfather how she was tortured by the Gestapo. And my grandfather had tears streaming down his cheeks, and from that moment he never drank any champagne other than Paul Roger. And when he died, they changed all the labels to black, and their premier champagne is the Sir Winston Churchill vintage.
This is the wartime visitors book, Mr. Frank, and you can see on the left-hand page the signatures of the King, George R.I., and the Queen, Elizabeth R., that's the Queen's mother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and beneath it, Field Marshal Schmucks, who had been President of South Africa. And immediately beneath that, General Eisenhower, General Sparks, General Ira Eaker, and other US generals who came here for the very first time in May 1942.
I remember Ira Eaker. He gave me, when I was 3 years old, a 4-engine bomber, a little model. Ira Eaker, who was commander of the US 8th Army Air Force.
The deck of USS Augusta for the meeting that gave rise to the Atlantic Charter. And here's Franklin Roosevelt's signature.
He was aboard the USS Augusta, and my grandfather was aboard the HMS Prince of Wales, which 8 weeks later was torpedoed in Singapore, exactly, with the loss of all the crew, 5,000 men. The heaviest cross I have to bear is the Cross of Lorraine, which was the symbol of the Free French.
Now, this way, please.
Clive, 6 version.
We've done it. No, we haven't done it. This is a computer-controlled biographical lifeline, and you can select a range of dates. And the date that I've selected is the 10th of July, and it explains to you that on that date the Battle of Britain began. If we start the graphic, we should find.
Oh yeah. Right. Here comes camp.
Hold on.
It's like a big computer.
It is.
Yeah.
It is 13 computers, 13 video projectors.
And here come the German bombers down the. And look left. Look left. Down the screen.
Spitfire coming through. So that's the start of the battle. As we go a bit further on, we can open up a date for December. On the 7th of December, we have Churchill is at Chequers, his official country residence in Buckinghamshire, when he receives the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And there you see
Exactly. A son is born at Chequers. That's me, age 2, with my mother, and old Nanny Hall, who was 70 years old.
What was the name of your mother?
Pamela Digby. She became Pamela Churchill, and then Hayward, and eventually Harold. She was married to Abel Harold.
He was governor of New York.
That's right.
And a very rich man. Did you go out?
Not compared to you.
No. He owned a chief stockholder in the railway.
That's right. The Union Pacific.
Yeah.
They had to put a time delay of 10 minutes in because otherwise every little kid will trigger it off.
after the conclusion of hostilities. He liked to have visual aids into your grandfather.
Yeah, but the problem was at Yalta, and I got to speak at a conference next week, along with a Roosevelt grandson and a murderer's grandson, a Stalin grandson. Was talking in Maastricht about Yalta 60 years ago. But what people don't realize, they didn't come to the conference with a blank sheet of paper. The Red Army was already at the heart of Europe. It had already liberated Holy Forces vote, which came in over several weeks from overseas, because the conventional wisdom, the election was July 45. It was literally 3 or 4 weeks before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which transformed everything. But at the time the election took place, the conventional wisdom was it would take between 1 and 2 years and between 1 and 2 million Allied casualties to finish the war against Japan. And our boys had been at war for 5 years and they wanted home. And they thought that if they voted for a socialist prime minister, they would get home quicker, because my grandfather said, we stand with the Americans till it's all over. This is Victory Day on the balcony of, I was one of the 500,000 who were there on that day, waving my little Union Jack. They've put on loan to the museum, which starts at the small ones. At the left is the India General Service Medal when he was serving on the northwest frontier of India, what is today the Afghan border.
Is that Andaman?
No, that was Sudan, but that is one of the ones there. The Queen's Sudan Medal, 1896 to 98, when he charged with the 21st Lancers.
Yes.
This is my grandfather's funeral. Come a little closer.
I know that the train went very slowly till he got on the boat.
This is the lying in state at Westminster Hall, which goes back to the 11th century. Only, apart from kings and queens, the only ones who lie in state, or have lain in state, were Wellington after his death, and Gladstone was the only politician to have a state funeral. And here is New Palace Yard outside the House of Commons, and he was borne on a gun carriage, naval gun carriage, pulled by the naval ratings. It was a bitterly cold late January day with a strong northeasterly wind. The Queen Mother, the previous Queen, the present Queen, Prince Charles, Duke of Edinburgh, Sarah, the actress, and Mary, who's the only survivor to this day.
Mary's still alive.
Yeah, she is, and firing on all cylinders. She was 83.
And this garter is the garter with which she was invested by the Queen
Yeah.
as a lady companion.
The goal we just saw a moment ago. There I am, my wife Minnie, and my father right there, the Queen, Duke of Edinburgh, my cousin Nicholas Soames, my sister Arabella,
To be placed
to the
on
Tower of
map.
London.
And when you see the pictures of the cranes of the docks, watch very carefully, because something quite
You see all those
happened.
the jibs of the cranes. Oh, don't see it at the moment. Here we are getting on board my father and grandmother on the Port of London Authority ship Havenhall, and in those days London was still the biggest port in the world, and there were all these dockers, and every one of them was a card-carrying communist, and if anybody had ordered them to lower the jibs of their cranes, they would never have done it. They did it completely spontaneously, just at the moment that there was a fly past of lightning aircraft, and I think there was a lone Spitfire too. And we go down the river to Waterloo Station, where we board a special funeral train pulled by a Battle of Britain class locomotive. That was a painting of my grandfather, one or 2 years old, apparently. He had it there in Dublin. And that is John's wife, Sarah. She was quite a girl, Sarah. And when the great Duke had died, somebody had written a book which went out of its way to try to explain how noble were Marlborough's predecessors. She said, "That may be true for aught I know, but I have never valued any man for another man's worth."
On the left is Mr. Churchill's baby rattle.
A numner, which you sort of put in your mouth, or you blew. The other end's got a whistle if he wanted to summon a whiskey and soda or something. He had a wonderful collection of toy soldiers. I mean, several battalions in strength he had eventually.
Were these his?
Yes.
Yes.
And this is his nurse, Nanny Everest, who was, I mean, he was much closer to her than he ever was to his mother. He said of his mother, she shone for me like a gleaming star, but always at a distance. Here he is as a young cavalry officer, and you'll see the uniform.
What do you carry, Bob?
Blah.
He's probably not allowed to advertise the fact. Here are some of his schoolwork. Oh, and here he was punished. an entry in the school punishment book on the 25th of May, 1891, shows that he received 7 strokes of the cane for breaking into premises and doing damage. He came through alive, put it that way, and he killed several people along the way. This is when he was taken prisoner by the Boers in South Africa, and he didn't find imprisonment too much to his taste. He spent his 21st birthday there, 25th birthday, and he escaped a few days later, and he was grossly insulted when he discovered that the Boers had posted a reward, not of $25 million, which George W. has posted for bin Laden, but just £25 sterling to anyone who brings the escaped prisoner of war Churchill, dead or alive, to this office.
When he escaped, that was the revolver he was given by a South African gentleman to aid his escape, and afterwards he returned it to the South African with the gift of this gold watch, which is inscribed from Winston Churchill.
And here is his mother, who was of course American, from Brooklyn, New York, Jenny Jerome, and she, as her contribution to the South African War, she corralled a load of American ladies, and they funded a hospital ship called the May, and just about the first one to be wounded was her younger son Jack. But this is on loan by the gentleman who started Fiji Wood, my friend from Palm Beach in New York, David Gilman, who last year sold Fiji Wood.
Oh, you know, he sold it too cheap. 50 million cases, and he sold it for $50 million.
Is that all?
Yes, and I would have paid him double.
Why didn't you?
Well, I didn't know about it. It was too late, but when you where I have a house.
Uh-huh. Where are you, in the desert or?
Rancho Santa Fe.
Oh, right.
Yeah, right now in San Diego. It's in San Diego.
Grandfather's role as a soldier in the First
So,
World War.
in the First World War, he started off as First Lord of the Admiralty, and in charge of what was then the largest battle fleet in the world, and he prepared that for war with Germany. And then he didn't like the idea of British soldiers, as he put it, chewing barbed wire on the Western Front. He knew enough about soldiering from his experience over 20 years to realize the potential of the machine gun in entrenched positions behind barbed wire. And he felt that if we couldn't make progress through the front door, then we should try the windows or the back door. And so he had his experts study either a left flank attack through Borkum Island in the Baltic or through the Dardanelles and Turkey. And eventually they settled on that. And
45,000 people were killed there. So
yeah, but more than that. But that was on the day of the landings, I think, 25,000. But the enterprise came very close to success. What we didn't know was that the Turkish forts who were manning the Narrows were down to their last half dozen shells. And if the naval commander on the spot had persisted for another 36 hours, and we'd lost a dozen major battleships, but we had plenty more in reserve. If he hadn't failed to follow through, we would have been in Constantinople. Turkey would have been knocked out of the war. We would have linked hands with Russia. It might have forestalled the Russian collapse and the consequent communist revolution. And then we could have attacked Germany through its unprotected back door at the east. That was his theory. And unfortunately, it didn't quite work out, and he was made the scapegoat, and he had to resign from office. And so he went into the trenches as a soldier in 1916. and this was the pistol he took with him. And he commanded a battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers in the line. He took up painting when he was 40 years old. And this is his headquarters in reserve. They would spend 6 days in the front line, 6 days in reserve, which was about 6 or 8 miles back. And this was called Lawrence Farm, at a place in Flanders called Plug Street to the British Tommy. My Flemish wife tries to instruct me it's Plugstad, but the British Tommy had it right, much easier to call it Plug Street. And this is his second in command, who went on to be aviation minister in the Second World War, who was seated there. And one of his many brushes with death occurred here, that a general had invited him to meet him the next day at 3 p.m. at a crossroads 5 miles away. And just as my grandfather was about to set out mid-morning, there was suddenly a mother and father of an artillery barrage, and he held off going to the last minute, and then realizing if he delayed any longer he'd be late for the general. Cursing the general, he made his way 5 miles across rain-soaked fields, deep in mud, on foot, and he eventually gets to the rendezvous point, waits for the general, no general, and the general has looked out the window, seen all the whiz-bangs flying, and decided this is not the day for social visits. And so, cursing the general even more, he comes back, as by the time he gets back here, it's dark, to find that under one of these buildings they had built a reinforced bunker for the officers, and in his absence it had taken a direct hit and all his colleagues had been killed.
Wow.
And so after that he laid off cursing the general. It's got a fantastic view. He bought it for the view. It has a view 30 miles across the most beautiful part of Kent.
Oh, there it is.
And would you believe it? In 1945, the man who did more than any to save the world from Hitler was effectively bankrupt, because the only way he knew how to earn his living was with his pen, and he hadn't been able to write for 6 years. And in 1946, he even had to sell his beloved charcoal. Luckily, a very wealthy well-wisher, Lord Camrose, who was the proprietor of the Daily Telegraph newspaper, heard of this and was so outraged, he corralled 10 of his friends, and they each put up £5,000 sterling. And for the princely sum of £55,000, which in those days would have equated to $200,000, purchased charcoal off my grandfather on the understanding that my grandparents would live there till the end of their days. This is the study where he wrote all his great books.
Mr. Churchill.
You must have seen it many times. Now, do you know how that was taken? But do you know why he was mad? Because my grandfather was puffing a cigar, and Karsh, who was a Canadian photographer, he got all set up under his, that thing is under his hood, as the one did in those days, and then he has the bulb in his hand to take the photograph, and he comes up to my grandfather and whips the cigar out of his mouth.
Oh my God.
That was the reaction. I wasn't yet born, but it was also the fact that the Labour Party refused to serve under Halifax, but they said they would serve under Churchill. But this is the very door of 10 Downing Street, which had to be removed a few years ago when the IRA started lobbing bombs at Mrs. Thatcher. And so they've now put in a reinforced steel one. But this is the original door of number 10. And on the night that he became Prime Minister, which was the 10th of May 1940, the very same day that Hitler's Blitzkrieg was launched into Belgium, France, and the Low Countries, he wrote, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And he added that he slept very soundly.
The first room you see is where the Prime Minister's detectives slept. So all you guys who were with Mr. Frank, this is the kind of accommodation.
Yeah, they wouldn't support that kind of accommodation.
We prefer clarity.
And here on the right, look above your head, where the right, Mr. Bracken. Detectives.
Joe.
And there in his pajamas, or alleged to be his pajamas.
All right, get a movie of Bracken.
And then this is the Prime Minister's dining room.
This is Brennan Bracken.
But he hated being down here because it stank. And another reason it stank wasn't just the smoke pollution, but also there was no proper, unbelievably, there was no proper sanitation. And all they had was what was called L-sand buckets, which were buckets of sand. And so the place stank.
This is the room where the chiefs of staff met, conference room, and some of the original maps. And if you can very clearly the honour of your presence, which one of the officers drew very cheaply on the map. And the visitor's book, and Mr. Churchill and others would come and congregate here to hear the latest advice of the chiefs of staff.
Wonderful.
Okay. Now,
All right, I think I'll leave now. I've seen everything I want to see. It's wonderful. I'll see you tonight.
Well, we've got to, well, I suppose we can go, is the room for the wheelchair going through the
main corridor.
Yeah.
It won't take.
It won't.
There will be several places where
Yes.
Frank happened.
Because we could have shown you my grandfather's bedroom and things like that, but don't worry, don't worry. For a
See you
future
in the
visit.
chat room.
Yes, exactly.
By Prince Andrew.
Probably a taken already, but my
Coming back into the corridor.
Go ahead, Grant. Go ahead, you go first.
They just shut the doors. They shut the doors there.
No,
It was unopened for 25 years.
It's a real, like the old part of the museum is a real time.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful. And there's a small token of take away with you. This is the handbook for the museum, and that is his granddaughter's account of Mr. Churchill's life, which I hope you will enjoy.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Now, what? We go back some more?
Need some picture.
Get a
picture with Winston Churchill.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. We need some pictures too. Bobby.
Where's Randolph?
I'm here, Sidney.
Let's go
get some
with your
pictures?
father. I want a picture with him.
Fantastic.
And you. Okay.
Well, great pleasure to welcome you here.
Oh, I love your stories, which are not
In any book.
great. Great being with you, Mister. Where's Randolph?
I'm here, Sidney.
Right over
There-
here.
there
he is.
with Mara.
I should be wearing a brighter jacket soon.
Pleasure being with you, bud.
Very nice.
Okay, Joe.
All good.
Sounds good.
Great.
Wonderful.
The cars are here and the wheelchair is right behind you, Cam.
Sit back in the wheelchair and we'll just take you
Take a couple steps back.
Good.
I see the inside's even louder than the outside.
My jumpsuit.
Well, keep on jumping.
Thank you.
Let's see you this evening.